Lupe Velez demanded his blood. Marlene Dietrich demanded his soul. Gary Cooper, the towering monument of American masculinity, became the collateral damage in Hollywood's most vicious power struggle. This was a synchronized execution. By night, Velez shredded his flesh to mark her territory. By day, Dietrich froze his mind with chilling, aristocratic apathy. The highest paid actor on earth was reduced to a paralyzed hostage, trapped between two apex predators who weaponized sex, violence, and silence to completely destroy each other. When the press documented these entanglements in the 1930s, they utilized a vocabulary deliberately designed to pacify the public. They sold a heavily sanitized illusion where men were the conquerors and women were swooning captives of romance, but strip away the sepia-toned nostalgia of Paramount Pictures, and you uncover a reality that is far more primal and infinitely more violent. Beneath the manufactured glamour, Hollywood operated with the ruthless mechanics of a meat grinder. In this specific ecosystem, the ultimate prize, the most valuable piece of meat on the open market, was Gary Cooper. The public viewed him as the definitive monument to American masculinity. The studio spent millions lighting his jawline and scripting him with lines of rugged brevity. He played cowboys, soldiers, and unyielding heroes. Yet, away from the public eye and the carefully constructed studio narratives, Cooper was reduced to a highly contested prize. He was inherently passive. His towering 6'3" frame housed a man terrified of conflict. He required a director to tell him where to stand, a publicist to tell him what to say, and a dominant woman to tell him how to live. Paramount in the early 1930s was governed by a ruthless, unspoken caste system. Power was not handed down by executives, it was seized on the lot. Cooper's psychological weakness made him the perfect prey. He was a sheep dressed in wolf clothing, a massive reservoir of cultural capital, waiting for anyone ruthless enough to sink their claws in. Lupe Velez was the first to sink her claws. She did not arrive in Hollywood seeking artistic validation. Born in Mexico, she clawed her way into the American studio system through the grueling, unforgiving circuits of vaudeville and burlesque. She had survived her teenage years sleeping in freezing train cars, dodging the aggressive advances of predatory theater managers, and learning to read the shifting power dynamics of a room before the first drink was poured. In that subterranean world, weakness meant starvation, and diplomacy was a luxury reserved for the rich. She built a ruthless exterior to survive the grueling theater circuits, knowing that striking first was her only absolute defense against a system designed to exploit her. In these dilapidated venues, she was constantly bombarded by xenophobic caricatures and forced to negotiate her wages with men who viewed her ethnicity as an open invitation for exploitation. She quickly learned that leaning into a persona of dangerous, untamable volatility was the only way to establish rigid boundaries in rooms filled with predatory managers. This survival mechanism solidified her understanding that fear was a far more reliable shield than talent, transforming her public identity into a preemptive strike against abuse. She arrived in Los Angeles not as a naive dreamer, but as a battle-hardened tactician who viewed every studio executive as just another adversary trying to cheat her. In the grueling Hal Roach comedy shorts where she secured her early breaks, she performed her own dangerous physical stunts without a safety net, learning that a willingness to endure and inflict pain translated directly into screen time. She observed how compliant actresses were swiftly replaced the moment a younger face appeared, whereas the difficult, explosive women forced the studios into negotiations. She recognized that Hollywood, beneath its glamorous veneer, operated on the exact same predatory mechanics as the underground theaters she had clawed her way out of. Volatility was not a lack of discipline. It was a calculated insurance policy against being rendered invisible. She understood instantly that the men running the studios viewed her as an exotic, disposable novelty. Instead of fighting the stereotype, she weaponized it. She embraced the studio-mandated moniker of the Mexican Spitfire. She realized that in a corporate structure dominated by older, wealthy, conservative men, raw, unpredictable aggression was a highly effective currency. When Lupe Velez set her sights on Gary Cooper, she did not woo him. She annexed him. The relationship between Lupe and Cooper was a masterclass in primitive physical domination. Lupe did not employ the subtle manipulative tactics of the casting couch, nor did she seek the corporate protection of a wedding ring. She established her authority through brute force. She recognized the void in Cooper's personality and stepped into it, assuming total dictatorship over his daily existence. She became his manager, his warden, and his physical tormentor. The physical reality of their relationship was an open, bleeding secret on the Paramount lot. Lupe managed her lover not with affection, but with inflicted trauma. Every morning, studio makeup artists routinely applied heavy layers of grease paint and ice packs to cover the deliberate scratch marks and fresh bruises raked across Cooper's chest, back, and arms. These injuries were not the result of clumsy accidents. They were deliberate physical branding. In the cold, clinical logic of power dynamics, Lupe Velez was marking her territory. Just as a lioness shreds the bark of a tree to warn competing predators to stay away, Lupe utilized Cooper's flesh as a billboard. She sent him onto the closed sets, into the executive offices, and into the commissary, bearing the physical, unmistakable evidence of her dominance. She was broadcasting a lethal message to every single actress, extra, and script girl within the gates of Paramount Pictures. She was stating unequivocally that the most desired male specimen in the world was on her leash, and she possessed the absolute power to draw his blood whenever she pleased. While fan magazines published highly choreographed, sepia-toned photographs of the couple smiling on horseback or hosting elegant Sunday brunches, the studio fixers were secretly paying off dry cleaners to destroy Cooper's blood-stained dress shirts. The publicity department worked overtime to frame her feral violence as Latin passion, deliberately mistranslating domestic abuse into a highly marketable exotic romance. They were selling tickets to a slaughter. The humiliation of the American male idol was absolute. Gary Cooper, the man paid thousands of dollars a week to project an image of unbreakable strength, would sit in the makeup chair, flinching as the alcohol swabs touched his open wounds, completely incapable of defending himself against a woman half his size. He was a prisoner of his own passivity. The psychological whiplash of this dual existence began to fracture his sense of reality. He would spend his mornings on sound stages, forcefully rescuing damsels in distress and projecting an aura of absolute patriarchal authority for the rolling cameras. Yet the moment the director yelled, "Cut!" his posture would immediately collapse, reverting to the trembling, submissive target who dreaded the inevitable ride home to his actual tormentor. This extreme compartmentalization required him to completely dissociate from his own body, turning him into a paralyzed spectator of his own glamorous, agonizing life. He did not leave her. He did not report the abuse to the studio executives. He submitted entirely to the regime. He was trapped in a cycle of high-octane, violent consumption. He became addicted to the adrenaline of her rage. Lupe possessed a kinetic, terrifying energy that completely overwhelmed his hollow nature. If she was not screaming at him, if she was not throwing glassware at his head, he felt entirely unmoored. He became entirely dependent on her chaotic energy, trading his autonomy for a daily existence defined by relentless friction. Lupe Velez reinforced this private violence with public displays of ownership that bordered on the theatrical. She did not politely accompany him to premieres or industry dinners. She paraded him like a conquered head of state. If another woman merely glanced at Cooper at a Hollywood party, Lupe would detonate. She would physically position herself between Cooper and the perceived threat, raising her voice, hurling obscenities, and daring the other woman to step closer. She used public embarrassment as a primary containment strategy. She ensured that the social and physical cost of approaching Gary Cooper was simply too high for any rational woman to pay. Paramount Pictures watched this daily degradation of their most valuable male star and did absolutely nothing to intervene. The studio executives, men who meticulously micromanaged the diets, the hair colors, and the moral clauses of their female contract players, turned a blind eye to the domestic abuse of Gary Cooper. The reason was entirely economic. The public narrative of the fiery, dangerous romance was selling tickets. The executives noticed that the genuine fear and exhaustion in Cooper's eyes translated into a compelling, brooding vulnerability on the silver screen. They monetized his trauma. They allowed Lupe to use their golden boy as a scratching post because the resulting publicity generated millions of dollars in box office revenue. They effectively outsourced the management of their star to a woman willing to use physical violence to keep him in line. For years, Lupe Velez sat at the absolute apex of the Paramount hierarchy. She had successfully conquered the studio's most prized asset. She had established a perimeter of violence that kept all competitors at bay. She believed her reign was permanent. She believed that her brand of raw, aggressive physical dominance was the ultimate weapon in the Hollywood arsenal. She operated under the assumption that intimidation would forever secure her monopoly. She failed to realize a fundamental truth about those at the absolute top of the hierarchy. Primitive violence is completely useless against a predator who does not bleed. Lupe Velez ruled the jungle through heat and noise, but the jungle was about to freeze over. The studio executives, perpetually searching for new revenue streams and international prestige, had just signed a contract with a German actress. They imported a woman forged in the cynical, hyper-sophisticated cabarets of the Weimar Republic. They imported a woman who did not scream, who did not scratch, and who did not lose her temper. They imported a woman who operated with the cold, mechanical precision of an assassin. The territorial lines had been drawn in blood. The prey was already exhausted, battered, and psychologically depleted. A transatlantic ocean liner was carrying Marlene Dietrich toward Paramount Pictures, bringing a cold Weimar-forged pragmatism that would fundamentally shatter the studio's power dynamics. The collision was imminent. The era of brute force was ending, and the era of psychological warfare was about to begin. The arrival of Marlene Dietrich at Paramount in 1930 was not a casting choice. It was a calculated psychological strike. Paramount executives did not import Dietrich from Germany to find a romantic lead. They imported her to execute a highly specific corporate mandate. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer possessed Greta Garbo, a European import who was generating millions through an aura of untouchable aristocratic mystique. Paramount needed their own European monolith to balance the financial scales. They needed a woman who could project absolute, unyielding superiority. They found her in the cynical, hyper-sophisticated cabaret culture of the Weimar Republic. Marlene Dietrich operated on an entirely different level of ruthlessness. Lupe was forged in the physical struggle of vaudeville. She survived by screaming the loudest and hitting the hardest. She was heat, friction, and noise. Marlene was forged in the aftermath of World War I, in a Berlin decimated by hyperinflation, societal collapse, and extreme psychological trauma. She had survived an environment where physical violence was mundane. To survive in Weimar Berlin, you did not scream. You detached. You learned to observe the desperation of others with a cold, clinical eye. You weaponized your own apathy. She had come of age in a ruined metropolis where the national currency was worthless, political assassinations were commonplace, and cabarets functioned as cynical sanctuaries for a deeply traumatized populace. In that bleak environment, exhibiting genuine emotion was viewed as a fatal vulnerability, a naive luxury that the citizens of a defeated nation could no longer afford. Dietrich absorbed this ambient nihilism, realizing the true power lay in observing the frantic scrambling of others while remaining entirely, unnervingly still. She packed this icy stoicism alongside her tailored suits, bringing a weaponized form of European disillusionment into the brightly lit, desperately earnest landscape of California. When Marlene Dietrich stepped off the ocean liner and onto American soil, she brought this lethal, freezing detachment with her. She looked at the sprawling, sun-drenched, melodramatic landscape of Hollywood and recognized it immediately for what it was, a playground of overpaid children. She did not feel intimidated by the studio executives. She did not feel a desperate need to be loved by the American public. And most dangerously, she did not feel an ounce of fear toward the established hierarchy of the Paramount lot. She surveyed the ecosystem. She identified the apex. She saw Gary Cooper. To Marlene Dietrich, Gary Cooper was not a cinematic idol. He was not a cowboy, a hero, or a symbol of rugged American masculinity. He was a piece of real estate. He was the highest peak on the Paramount lot, and a flag bearing the name of Lupe Velez was currently planted firmly at the summit. Marlene did not target Cooper because she was overwhelmed by physical lust. Lust is a vulnerability. It requires a surrender of control. Marlene Dietrich did not surrender control to anyone. She targeted Gary Cooper because he was the most efficient, ruthless mechanism available to establish her absolute dominance over the studio. Conquering the highest-paid male star and publicly humiliating the most violent territorial woman on the lot in the process was not a romance. It was a hostile corporate takeover. It was a strategic maneuver designed to prove to the Paramount executives, the press, and every other actress in California that a new regime had been installed. The battlefield for this usurpation was the soundstage of the 1930 film Morocco. Paramount assigned Joseph von Sternberg to direct the picture. Von Sternberg was Marlene's creator, her mentor, and her fiercely loyal collaborator from Germany. He possessed a dictatorial control over his sets. He was a man obsessed with lighting, shadow, and the absolute perfection of Dietrich's face. When Gary Cooper walked onto the set of Morocco, he believed he was the leading man. He believed his status as America's top box office draw granted him authority. He was completely unaware that he had just walked into a sophisticated European psychological slaughterhouse. The psychological warfare began on the very first day of production. It did not begin with a screaming match. It began with linguistics. Von Sternberg and Dietrich deliberately, repeatedly communicated exclusively in German. In the middle of a complex scene, while Cooper stood under the blistering heat of the arc lamps waiting for direction, von Sternberg would turn his back on the American star and engage in long, whispered, intense conversations with Dietrich in a language Cooper could not comprehend. They would laugh quietly. They would adjust the lighting. They would completely ignore his presence. This was not a casual linguistic barrier. It was a calculated strategy of isolation. Lupe Velez controlled Cooper by giving him too much attention, by overwhelming his senses with violence and noise. Marlene Dietrich controlled him by starving him of existence, by refusing to acknowledge him, by treating him as a non-entity, an inanimate prop that simply occupied space until it was required to speak a line of dialogue. Marlene stripped Gary Cooper of his entire identity. Cooper was a man whose entire psychological framework was built on being the center of the cinematic universe. He was used to directors coddling him. He was used to Lupe Velez physically attacking him out of a desperate need to own him. He possessed absolutely no defense mechanisms against complete aristocratic indifference. Marlene doubled down on the psychological castration by subverting the very foundation of his corporate value, his masculinity. In Morocco, Marlene Dietrich famously wears a men's tuxedo, a top hat, and smokes a cigarette with the arrogant swagger of a wealthy industrialist. She performs a cabaret number, walks into the audience, and kisses a woman on the lips. In 1930, this was a visual earthquake, but the true violence of the tuxedo was not aimed at the audience. It was aimed directly at Gary Cooper. By adopting the visual markers of male authority, Marlene Dietrich effectively occupied Cooper's own gender role. She was the one who projected power, cynicism, and control. Cooper, by contrast, was relegated to the traditional female role. He was the object of the gaze. He was the beautiful, passive, slightly bewildered prize waiting to be claimed. Marlene looked at him not with the adoring eyes of a traditional leading lady, but with the predatory, assessing stare of a man evaluating a horse at an auction. She stripped him of his patriarchal armor and exposed him as a mere commodity. The psychological impact of this gender subversion bled immediately into Cooper's off-screen reality. He began to stutter uncontrollably during basic script read-throughs, his hands trembling so violently that he had to hide them inside his costume pockets. He spent hours obsessively pacing outside von Sternberg's office, desperately begging for additional lines of dialogue to reassert his dominance, completely oblivious to the fact that his rising panic was exactly what Dietrich found so endlessly amusing. The humiliation eroded Cooper's nervous system. He complained to the studio executives. He stated that von Sternberg was favoring Dietrich, that the lighting was designed entirely for her face, that he was being treated as a secondary asset on his own picture. The executives did nothing. They were watching the dailies. They saw the agonizing, desperate tension in Cooper's eyes on screen. They saw a man being psychologically disassembled by a woman who looked at him like he was entirely disposable. It was cinematic gold. The executives prioritized the profit margins of the psychological torture over the sanity of their star. Lupe Velez, possessing the primal instincts of a territorial predator, immediately sensed the shift in the atmospheric pressure. She recognized that the physical marks she left on Cooper's body were no longer an effective containment strategy. She could scratch his back until it bled. She could bruise his arms, but she could not leave a mark on his mind. Cooper was returning home from the set of Morocco physically intact but psychologically absent. He was no longer reacting to Lupe's violence with the same subservient fear. His fear had been rerouted. He was now terrified of the cold, silent judgment of the German woman in the tuxedo. Lupe escalated her tactics. She increased the volume. She increased the physical altercations. She demanded constant reassurance. She attempted to drag Cooper back into the familiar chaotic gravity of their abusive dynamic. She operated under the fatal misconception that if she inflicted enough physical pain, she could break the psychological hold of her rival. The collision between the two women was not a crude fistfight. It was a sophisticated proxy war fought entirely on the geography of Gary Cooper's eroding nervous system. Velez, driven by the survival instincts of the streets, attempted a physical blockade. She prowled the edges of the Morocco sound stages, pacing outside the heavy soundproof doors, utilizing her sheer acoustic volume to remind the German actress of her territory. She weaponized her presence, glaring at Dietrich across the commissary, hoping to provoke the kind of violent, chaotic friction she understood and controlled. Velez believed that in the Hollywood jungle, the loudest predator survived. Dietrich, having witnessed the collapse of an entire European nation, knew that true power belonged to the entity that refused to bleed. Instead of engaging in a territorial dispute, Dietrich and her director constructed an impenetrable cultural fortress. They transformed the set into an exclusive European intellectual enclave, speaking rapidly in German and discussing Weimar cabaret politics. Velez, a veteran of vaudeville survival, found her physical aggression utterly useless against a wall of high society intellectual exclusion. She was not defeated by a louder scream. She was asphyxiated in a vacuum. When Velez escalated her campaign to elite Hollywood gatherings, deliberately dropping thinly veiled insults, or staging chaotic entrances to shatter Dietrich's pristine aura, the German actress executed the most devastating countermaneuver in the cinematic arsenal. She deployed absolute freezing apathy. Dietrich did not scowl, she did not retreat, and she certainly never raised her voice. She simply allowed her gaze to drift through Velez as if the enraged woman were a minor trick of the light. By denying Velez even a fraction of a reaction, Dietrich stripped her rival of her existence. She transformed Hollywood's most feared territorial fighter into an impotent phantom, proving that the most lethal weapon in the industry was not a clenched fist, but a closed door. She failed to understand that Marlene Dietrich was not fighting a physical war. Marlene was fighting an insurgency of the mind. Marlene did not actively seduce Gary Cooper. Seduction implies an effort to persuade. Marlene simply allowed Cooper to fall into the vacuum she had created. Cooper, starved of validation on the set, linguistically isolated by the director, and battered by the desperate, exhausting violence of Lupe Velez at home, sought the only escape route available. He sought the approval of the Weimar pragmatist. He gravitated toward Marlene not out of uncontrollable romantic passion, but out of a desperate, humiliating need to be acknowledged by the very woman who was destroying his ego. He wanted her to look at him. He wanted her to validate his existence. He submitted to her completely, transferring his obedience from the loud, violent dictator to the silent, aristocratic autocrat. The consummation of their affair was not a fiery explosion of hidden desire. It was the quiet, inevitable signing of a surrender document. Marlene Dietrich absorbed Gary Cooper into her orbit without breaking a sweat, without raising her voice, and without ever compromising her pristine, heavily lit image. She did not leave physical bruises on his skin. She left a permanent, freezing brand on his psyche. She proved that the ultimate form of dominance is not physical violence. It is the ability to make a human being desperately beg for your attention while you treat them like a ghost. She had successfully seized the highest peak in Hollywood. She had captured the most valuable corporate asset Paramount Pictures possessed. And she had done it right in front of the cameras, right in front of the executives, and right in front of the woman who thought she owned him. The containment protocols of Paramount Pictures entirely failed to anticipate the explosive yield of a dethroned star. The executives sitting in their mahogany offices believed that the transfer of Gary Cooper from Lupe Velez to Marlene Dietrich would remain a private, internal corporate restructuring. They assumed that the rigid social etiquette of the Hollywood studio system, enforced by morality clauses and the ever-present threat of contract termination, would force Lupe to accept her demotion in silence. They gravely miscalculated the psychology of a woman whose entire brand, survival, and territorial authority were built on raw, unadulterated public violence. Lupe Velez did not accept the termination of her monopoly. She recognized instantly that the private psychological warfare waged on the soundstage of Morocco was a battle she had already lost. Marlene Dietrich possessed an impenetrable armor of aristocratic apathy that rendered Lupe's domestic physical abuse completely obsolete. You cannot scratch the back of a ghost. You cannot break glass over the head of a woman who refuses to acknowledge you are in the room. Deprived of her private leverage, Lupe executed a drastic, scorched earth tactical pivot. She moved the theater of war from the closed, heavily guarded sound stages of Culver City directly out onto the sunlit, highly visible pavement of Los Angeles. In the 1930s, the Hollywood gossip machinery did not operate through anonymous digital leaks. It operated through physical proximity. Power and humiliation were established at very specific geographical coordinates: the front tables of the Brown Derby restaurant, the red carpets of the Chinese theater, and the sprawling driveways of the elite Beverly Hills estates. Lupe decided to weaponize this geography. She determined that if she could not privately break Marlene Dietrich's psychological hold over Gary Cooper, she would publicly annihilate the dignity of both the thief and the stolen property. The eruption occurred in the most spectacular, humiliating fashion possible. The press corps of the era, a swarm of men in fedoras gripping heavy flashbulb-equipped cameras, were perpetually starved for authentic conflict. The studios fed them carefully curated, sanitized narratives of glamorous stars sipping martinis. Lupe handed them a slaughterhouse. According to the entrenched lore and corroborated eyewitness accounts of the era, the confrontation did not take the form of a polite, icy exchange of insults at a cocktail party. It was a kinetic, physical ambush. Lupe Velez tracked the movements of her former asset. When Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich appeared together in public, effectively confirming the corporate takeover to the world, Lupe intercepted them. She did not wait on the sidewalk. She physically blockaded their vehicle. The audacity of the ambush was absolute and terrifying. A heavy, polished luxury automobile, the ultimate symbol of Hollywood elite status, forced to a halt by a woman who refused to be liquidated. Lupe Velez planted herself in the path of the machine. She completely abandoned the carefully maintained facade of the demure, elegant movie star. She tapped into the primal survivalist rage that had carried her out of the Mexican vaudeville circuit. She unleashed a torrent of profound, unfiltered profanity. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing down the boulevard, ensuring that every reporter, every bystander, and every studio spy in the vicinity could hear exactly what happens when you steal from the reigning queen of the lot. She did not beg Gary Cooper to return to her. Begging is the language of the powerless. She attacked the usurper. She pointed directly at Marlene Dietrich, who was seated inside the safety of the vehicle, and issued a threat of specific physical mutilation. She announced to the assembled press that she was going to tear the German woman apart. She famously, explicitly threatened to gouge Marlene Dietrich's eyes out. The sheer volume and specificity of her rage caused an immediate physical shock wave down the boulevard. Seasoned reporters actually stopped winding their heavy camera cranks, and pedestrians froze in terror, suddenly realizing that the carefully manicured illusion of Hollywood civility had just been violently ruptured. It was a moment of unscripted, terrifying reality where the multi-million-dollar corporate containment protocols completely evaporated, leaving the studio's two most valuable properties standing inches away from lethal dismemberment. The threat possessed an extreme clinical precision. Lupe Velez did not threaten to ruin Marlene's reputation. She did not threaten to ruin her career. She threatened to blind her. She targeted the exact physical asset that Joseph von Sternberg spent hundreds of hours meticulously lighting. She targeted the icy, assessing, predatory eyes that had stripped Gary Cooper of his masculinity and lured him into submission. Lupe was proposing a surgical strike on the very foundation of Marlene's corporate value. She was promising to physically dismantle the million-dollar face of Paramount Pictures. The air was thick with the explosive potential of physical violence. The flash bulbs erupted, capturing the raw, unhinged fury of the deposed queen. The entire Hollywood establishment held its breath, waiting for the physical altercation, waiting for the two most valuable female properties on the lot to tear each other to shreds in the street. It was in this exact highly volatile fraction of a second that Marlene Dietrich executed the most lethal, devastating counterattack in the history of celebrity warfare. Marlene Dietrich did not open the door. She did not roll down the window. She did not scream back. She did not flinch. She did not scowl. And she did not order her driver to run Lupe over. Marlene Dietrich simply looked forward. She responded with absolute chilling silence. She sat perfectly still, her features frozen in absolute aristocratic boredom. She allowed her gaze to pass completely through Lupe Velez, as if the screaming, enraged woman blocking the vehicle was nothing more than a trick of the light, a minor atmospheric disturbance, a sudden gust of wind rattling a window pane. In the brutal mathematics of dominance, a fight requires two participants of equal standing. If you scream at an opponent and they scream back, you have established a perimeter of equality. You have forced them to recognize your power. By deploying total, unbroken silence, Marlene transmitted a message far more destructive than any physical blow. She communicated to the press, to the studio, and directly into the marrow of Lupe's bones that the Mexican Spitfire was not a rival. She was not a threat. She was vermin. She was a loud, vulgar peasant barking outside the gates of an estate she would never be permitted to enter. In an industry that had recently revolutionized itself by transitioning from silent films to talkies, Dietrich ingeniously weaponized the absence of sound to establish ultimate superiority. She understood that a reaction, even a whispered insult, would validate Velez's existence and legitimize the confrontation. By withholding her voice, she effectively edited her rival out of the scene entirely, utilizing a cinematic technique in real time to render the physical threat completely invisible. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation that proved volume is the tool of the desperate, while absolute silence is the luxury of the untouchable. Marlene casually reached for a cigarette, lit it, and waited for the obstacle to be cleared from her path. She reduced a woman prepared to commit murder into a minor traffic inconvenience. The psychological devastation inflicted upon Lupe Velez in that moment was absolute and irreversible. Her primary weapon, the threat of physical violence, had been neutralized by total apathy. You cannot fight a vacuum. Lupe was left screaming into the void, surrounded by photographers who were no longer documenting a clash of titans, but the pathetic, unhinged breakdown of a woman who had lost her territory and her mind. The humiliation burned through her entire nervous system. She had attempted to publicly execute her rival, and instead she had handed Marlene Dietrich the ultimate victory lap. And seated directly next to Marlene, trapped in the passenger seat of the luxury vehicle, was the spoils of the war. The destruction of Gary Cooper was now complete. He was the highest paid male star in the American cinematic apparatus, a man whose face was printed on millions of movie posters, holding rifles and staring down villains. Yet, in the defining moment of his personal existence, he was entirely paralyzed. He did not step out of the car to intervene. He did not defend his new lover. He did not attempt to calm his former captor. He sat there shrinking into the upholstery, crushed by the gravitational pull of the two female titans, waging a proxy war over his flesh. The extreme psychological pressure of his existence finally broke his physical health. A human being cannot sustain the friction of projecting absolute, rugged, patriarchal authority for 12 hours a day under the hot studio lights, only to return home and function as a submissive, battered pawn in a war between two relentless female predators. The human nervous system is not designed to process that level of extreme, continuous contradiction. The facade cracked, and Cooper suffered a severe physical and psychological collapse. The medical records of the era tightly guarded by Paramount fixers, detail a grim clinical disintegration. The continuous pressure of projecting rugged authority on set while navigating a volatile domestic battlefield severely eroded his health, culminating in profound nervous exhaustion and dramatic weight loss. If he remained in Los Angeles caught in the crossfire, his career in biology would permanently shatter. The flight of Gary Cooper was not a glamorous European vacation. It was a desperate emergency medical evacuation. In a maneuver orchestrated by the studio to prevent a total loss of their investment, Cooper was extracted from the war zone. He was packed onto a train, transported across the country, and loaded onto an ocean liner bound for Europe. He was fleeing for his life. He left behind his mansion, his contracts, and the two women who had methodically stripped him of his autonomy. When Gary Cooper stood at the rail of the ship departing California, the symbol of American strength was trembling. He was malnourished and entirely broken. He had been chewed up by the primal kinetic violence of the casting couch and frozen solid by the calculating aristocratic apathy of the European import. He was a refugee from his own life. Following Cooper's medical extraction to Europe, the immediate hostilities between Velez and Dietrich dissolved, not through a formal truce, but through the sudden depletion of the battlefield. Paramount executives scrambled to contain the fallout, sanitizing the press coverage by framing Cooper's nervous exhaustion as a luxurious European holiday to study foreign cinema. They swept the reality off the floor and returned to the business of manufacturing illusions. The aftermath firmly established the new studio hierarchy. Dietrich emerged completely unscathed, her reputation for untouchable glamour only magnified by her calculated detachment. Velez, however, saw her volatile reign collapse. Her aggressive tactics, once highly profitable, were now viewed by the studio as a financial liability. The Cooper incident served as a chilling blueprint for Hollywood survival mechanics. In a system designed to consume raw human emotion, Dietrich proved that lasting dominance belonged to those who could completely master and eradicate their own empathy. Marlene Dietrich did not mourn the loss of Gary Cooper. To mourn is to admit a deficit. To mourn is to acknowledge that another human being possessed a piece of your psychological real estate. Marlene Dietrich owned herself entirely. When the trains carried the broken American idol away from California, Marlene simply returned to the set, checked her lighting, and continued to shoot her pictures. She treated Cooper's physical collapse not as a tragedy, but as a minor logistical inconvenience. She had utilized him to execute a hostile corporate takeover. She had successfully shattered her most violent rival, and she had established her absolute terrifying dominance over the Paramount hierarchy. The tool had served its purpose. The tool had broken under the pressure. She discarded the tool. This freezing, sociopathic level of detachment became the foundation of Dietrich's entire career, allowing her to outlast the very studio system that imported her. Marlene recognized a fundamental flaw in the construction of the Hollywood actress. Actresses were trained to project vulnerability, to seek the adoration of the audience, and to rely on male directors for validation. Marlene rejected this model completely. She understood that vulnerability is a depreciating asset. If you offer the public your genuine emotions, the public will consume them, digest them, and demand fresh meat. Instead of vulnerability, she offered the industry a fortress. She transformed the Ice Queen persona from a temporary tactical weapon into a permanent corporate brand. She micromanaged every single aspect of her physical appearance with the ruthless efficiency of a factory foreman. She studied the mechanics of the arc lamps. She learned exactly which camera lenses would flatten her cheekbones and which angles would elongate her legs. She possessed a mirror placed directly next to the camera on every set she worked on, allowing her to monitor her own reflection in real time while she acted. She did not trust directors to protect her image. She protected it herself. She eventually outgrew Josef von Sternberg, the man who brought her to America and orchestrated her initial rise. When von Sternberg's tyrannical directing style threatened her commercial viability, Dietrich severed the relationship with surgical precision, proving her ultimate loyalty was to her own brand, not her past. Marlene Dietrich treated men not as masters, but as luxury accessories. She engaged in numerous high-profile affairs with the most powerful men in the world, actors, writers, military generals, but she never allowed them to penetrate the armor. She never allowed a man to dictate her career choices, her geography, or her emotional stability. She treated romance as a temporary, entertaining transaction. By refusing to invest her soul into the Hollywood machinery, she prevented the machinery from consuming her. She survived the collapse of the studio system in the 1950s. She transitioned into a highly lucrative career as a global cabaret performer, demanding astronomical fees to stand perfectly still on stages from Las Vegas to London, wrapped in thousands of dollars of swan feathers and diamonds, singing with a voice that projected absolute cynical boredom. She maintained the illusion of untouchable perfection until the biology of aging finally forced her to retreat. And even then, she dictated the terms of her surrender. She locked herself in an apartment in Paris, refusing to let the public see her physical decline, demanding that the world remember her only as the flawless, terrifying conqueror of the 1930s. She died in 1992 at the age of 90. She won the long game because she understood that in a meat grinder, apathy is the only effective armor. While Dietrich engineered her own immortality through calculated detachment, Velez was entirely consumed by the very volatility that once made her powerful. Dietrich secured her legacy by retreating into silence, but Velez found herself trapped in an industry that rapidly penalized the exact same aggression it had previously monetized. Lupe operated on raw, unadulterated, primitive emotion. Her brand was volatility. Her currency was kinetic energy, but in the brutally efficient economy of Hollywood, kinetic energy is a finite resource. The public humiliation she suffered during the Gary Cooper scandal marked a fatal turning point in her corporate valuation. The studio executives had watched her scream in the street. They had watched her threaten physical mutilation. They realized that her aggression was not merely a controlled, marketable persona. It was a genuine, uncontrollable psychological instability. In the boardroom, instability is synonymous with financial risk. Paramount Pictures, and later the other major studios, began to quietly downgrade her status. They recognized that the Mexican Spitfire had lost her absolute dominance. She was no longer an apex predator. She was a wounded animal. And the Hollywood ecosystem ruthlessly culls the wounded. Lupe was systematically pushed out of the elite A-list prestige pictures. She was demoted to the B-movie assembly lines. RKO Pictures purchased her contract at a discount and slotted her into a series of cheap, repetitive comedies, literally titled the Mexican Spitfire series. They reduced her entire complex survivalist identity into a racist, one-dimensional caricature. These cheap productions completely erased the nuanced comedic timing she had honed over a decade, demanding instead a hyper-caffeinated, heavily accented minstrelsy. She was stripped of her glamorous wardrobe and forced to perform slapstick routines that aggressively mocked her own cultural heritage, turning her into a living cartoon for audiences who had once feared her power. The studios effectively monetized her dissent, transforming her previously terrifying aggression into a pathetic, easily digestible joke that confirmed the industry's ultimate control over her narrative. Every frame of these B-movies was a corporate punishment, a public demonstration of what happens to a woman who loses her leverage in the Hollywood machine. She was forced onto grueling high-speed production schedules, shooting 3 cheap pictures a year while wearing heavily altered recycled costumes discarded from A-list productions. The directors assigned to these low-budget features did not care about her lighting, her camera angles, or her artistic input. They only cared that she hit her marks and screamed loudly enough to hit the required runtime. This relentless, grinding factory environment rapidly accelerated her physical aging, stripping away the flawless beauty that had once been her primary instrument of power. She was paid to mispronounce English words, throw vases at walls, and act like a chaotic, hypersexualized clown. The industry took the very aggression that had once conquered Gary Cooper and turned it into a cheap punchline. Deprived of her professional dignity, Lupe attempted to assert dominance the only way she knew how, through high-friction, violent personal relationships. She could not detach. She did not know how to exist without the adrenaline of conflict. In 1933, she married Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic swimmer who achieved global superstardom playing Tarzan. It was another strategic acquisition of a highly valuable, hyper-masculine physical specimen, but the marriage was a grotesque repetition of the Gary Cooper dynamic, amplified to a terrifying degree. Weissmuller was not passive like Cooper. He fought back. Their domestic life was a war zone. The press documented a 5-year marriage defined by physical altercations, public screaming matches, and repeated calls to the local police. They beat each other. They filed for divorce, reconciled, and filed for divorce again in a cycle of mutual toxic consumption. Lupe was exhausting herself for a volatile marriage, a hungry press, and a studio system that readily monetized her pain. She was burning out her own nervous system simply to remain visible. By the early 1940s, the biological clock of the studio system began to toll. In the ruthless demographic calculus of the Golden Age, a female star whose primary asset was youthful, physical hypersexuality possessed a strict expiration date. By 1944, Lupe Velez was 36 years old. Her metabolism was slowing. The physical toll of a decade of domestic violence, grueling B-movie shooting schedules, and heavy alcohol consumption was etching lines into her face. The studios were already aggressively scouting the next generation of 19-year-old girls to feed into the machinery. Lupe was facing the absolute terror of corporate obsolescence. She was running out of territory. It was within this suffocating atmosphere of impending irrelevance that Lupe Velez made her final fatal miscalculation. She engaged in a relationship with a minor, virtually unknown Austrian actor named Harold Ramon. In the Hollywood caste system, this was a massive downgrade, a clear signal that her leverage had completely evaporated. During this affair, the 36-year-old actress discovered she was pregnant. In the year 1944, for an unmarried, aging Catholic actress, heavily reliant on a fragile public image to secure B-movie contracts, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy was not a personal crisis. It was a corporate death sentence. The morality clauses embedded in studio contracts were unforgiving. If the pregnancy became public, the Catholic Legion of Decency would boycott her films. The studios would immediately terminate her employment. She would be blacklisted. She would be stripped of her income, her mansion, and the only identity she had ever known. She would be forced back into the poverty she had spent her entire life desperately outrunning. Lupe demanded that Harold Ramon marry her. She demanded the wedding ring shield. She needed him to legitimize the pregnancy and save her corporate value. Ramon, recognizing her desperation and possessing no financial incentive to shackle himself to a declining star, refused. He offered to sign a document acknowledging paternity, but he flatly refused to provide the legal protection of marriage. Lupe Velez was cornered. She was trapped between the biological reality of her body and the sociopathic morality of the industry. She had no corporate protector. She had no psychological armor. The feral, aggressive energy that had allowed her to claw her way out of Mexico and conquer the biggest star in the world was entirely useless against a contract termination clause. She realized that the machine was finally going to consume her. So she decided to execute the only power she had left. She decided to dictate the visual aesthetics of her own liquidation. The suicide of Lupe Velez on December 13th, 1944, is one of the most brutally tragic events in Hollywood history. While the public narrative spun by the press claimed she died of a broken heart over a failed romance, the reality of her final days was far more clinical. She died because she was a discarded asset facing bankruptcy and public exile. She chose death over the humiliation of being evicted from the ecosystem. Lupe meticulously planned her exit. She possessed a profound understanding of Hollywood optics, and she intended to leave behind a pristine, perfectly art-directed corpse. She wanted her final image to be a permanent, glamorous rebuke to the industry that was preparing to discard her. She ordered her bedroom to be decorated with thousands of dollars worth of fresh white floral arrangements, transforming her home into a cinematic mausoleum. She lit dozens of candles to create soft, diffuse lighting, the kind of lighting the studios had long stopped paying for on her sets. She dressed herself in heavy, expensive silver lame pajamas. She styled her dark hair perfectly against her silk pillows. She arranged her own lighting, her own wardrobe, and her own set design. She consumed a massive, lethal overdose of Seconal pills, lying back against her silk pillows to wait for the chemicals to shut down her central nervous system. She sought to achieve in death the untouchable aristocratic perfection that Marlene Dietrich had achieved in life. When her secretary discovered her body the following morning, police reports confirmed she was lying exactly as she had staged it. Peaceful, hands folded over her chest, resting among the white flowers in her expensive silver lame pajamas. She had successfully directed her final scene, but the machinery of Hollywood is utterly indifferent to a perfect frame. The brutal studio system that consumed her life refused to grant her dignity in death. In the decades that followed, the Hollywood myth-making apparatus, driven by gossip columnists and cynical historians, stripped away her meticulously constructed exit. They fabricated a grotesque, sensationalized urban legend, claiming she died violently ill on her bathroom floor with her head in a toilet bowl. The brutality of this posthumous lie serves as a definitive, chilling indictment of the era's gossip machinery. Lupe Velez fought her entire existence for dignity and control. She bled for the corporation, and even after she successfully orchestrated a glamorous escape, the system rewrote her script, determined to reduce a fearsome conqueror to a humiliated punchline. The aftermath of this triad exposed the brutal reality of the studio system. Gary Cooper spent decades projecting a false masculine ideal until his death in 1961. Lupe Velez, unable to detach her genuine emotion from the corporate machine, was dead by 36. Marlene Dietrich outsourced her empathy, froze her assets, and lived to be 90. The industry digested this data. Recognizing the financial risk of raw, unpredictable human emotion, the executives pivoted. The era of the flesh and blood conqueror was liquidated, and the era of the synthetic, easily controlled bombshell had officially begun.